Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast. I am Chris Coulter and here with David Grayson. Hi, David.
Hi, Chris.
How's it going?
All's going well, thank you. Hope you
Excellent.
do.
Good. Thank you. And we have a very special guest that we're thrilled about, a colleague, a friend that both David and I had known for many years, Rupert Younger. Hi, Rupert.
Hi, both of you. Very nice to be here. I feel like I'm the third wheel in a very important conversation with two real legends in this space. So
Oh, my
thank you for
goodness.
having me alongside you. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and interview both of you to learn something.
The tables are turned already. Okay. And let me give a little background on Rupert for our listeners if you don't know Rupert. He is the director of the Center for Corporate Reputation at Side School of Business, University of Oxford. He's also the academic director of the Corporate Affairs Academy, also at Said. He is also the tutor in management at Jesus College at Oxford and the author of The Reputation Game, which is a fantastic and I think still very seminal and relevant book that everyone should go read if you haven't read it. Did we capture most of? You've got your hands in many pots. Did we capture them, Rupert?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I mean, the thing which I hope we're going to also cover is important extra element of purpose, because the Enacting Purpose Initiative, which I've co-chaired, I've chaired since 2019, co-chaired by Colin Mayer and Bob Eccles. We've produced a number of quite important, I think, contributions to how reputation and other social evaluations show up, in particular in the sustainability space around purpose, organizational purpose. So I just add that little extra bit into an otherwise extremely flattering biographical introduction. Thank you, Chris.
It is the facts. But let's begin at purpose, but in our proper conversation. But maybe just a little bit of background on your journey. How did you get to this place? What made you dive into both the field of corporate affairs and reputation and now purpose so deeply, both in an academic and a practitioner perspective?
So I started my career in communications, strategic communications, initially working for a couple of very large financial communications companies, handling or advising companies on their mergers and acquisitions, their regulatory strategies, their investor relations strategies, and engagement with the financial media. So that was my foundation, if you like, and my starting point in trying to understand how organizations communicate complex ideas in a very simple, easily understood way. And I got the bug, obviously, from that. And I co-founded an agency, which is now a very large agency called FGS Global. I co-founded that back in the mid 1990s with a colleague called Roland Rudd, ex-Financial Times journalist. And that business became obviously very successful. It was great fun working with a lot of incredibly interesting clients. Again, dealing with financial communications, but broadening that out into what we originally termed strategic communications, which is about how do you build your license to operate, and how do you orient the complexity of an organization so that people in different stakeholder groups understand and embrace and give you license to operate in the different spheres that are important to you. So that was really what we were doing in my professional world. And that business still exists, but I decided to transition into academia because I was more interested, really, I guess, in the foundation questions of why does this matter? How does this work? How does reputation get created, sustained, destroyed, and rebuilt? How and why is reputation linked to or different from status, legitimacy? How do you avoid stigmatization? What's happening with the celebritization of business at the minute? And of course, the increasingly prevalent discussion around trust in organizational life. So these were the subjects which really intrigued me. And I went to Oxford in 2008. Now I've been there actually longer than I was at Finsbury. It's a seminal moment to question my identity as a scholar versus a practitioner. But
David has a very parallel life experience, I think, right?
I think I've learned quite a lot from
David,
David.
actually, in fact, we first met when I was picking Rupert's brains before going to Cranfield to set up the Doughty Centre.
I
So,
remember this really well, and David, of course, has had a stellar career. That and the Cranfield Centre is fantastic, and but we shared a lot of interesting ideas and concepts, and I think this
Mm,
this sort of blend, which I think is such a powerful blend, but also such an important blend in academia of practice-based academics,
mm.
is a rarity, sadly, in academia, but it's a very important one. And if there are enough madmen like David and I who decide to leave the comfort and serenity and financial security of a nice corporate world to go into academia, we should be encouraging that, and we should be encouraging that. So really my journey then led to Oxford, and the centre I set up in 2008, and it's become the world leading centre on reputation and trust. And we now convene around 130 scholars each year who come to Oxford in late August each year to discuss and identify and progress the agenda for social
Mm.
evaluations, and our understanding of how and why they matter in organizational life. And so we published a lot in the academic space, obviously, both ourselves directly, but also with our research fellows. But and this, apologies for the very long
No,
answer to
no,
your
yeah, yeah.
very simple question, but getting us into, I guess, the starting point might be purpose, is that
Mm,
that led to the creation of the Enacting Purpose Initiative, which I created back in 2019, 2018, 2019, is co-chaired by Colin Mayer, a professor at the business school and former dean, in fact, and Bob Eccles. So two very, very brilliant co-chairs, and that business, or that institute, is trying to understand how words on a page get translated into action.
mm,
It's often boards struggle with this idea of how does our intent, often well-meaning and well-made, translate into authentic delivery. And actually, the reputational elements come when you get this disconnect between what a board says and what the organization does. So that was a spin-off that came out of the center back in 2018, 2019. And it shows you in a way that this center has become a flywheel for lots of different ideas and initiatives, which are increasingly so important in organizational life.
and Rupert, what was it that you were seeing around 2017, 2018 that made you say there is some synergies here with the work that people like Colin Mayer were already doing around purpose with the British Academy and so on? But what was it that you said, I think we've got something really valuable to fit into these discussions, to bring them to life and to give them some more meaning?
Yeah, I mean, really the key here is the word enacting. Colin, my co-chair, had led the British Academy work on the future of the corporation, and that was a discursive forum involving some really interesting conversations about the construct of what an organization's role in society is. And it became very, very intriguing, very, very important. But in a way, the bit that was missing in that is how does that get translated into what all companies do, or people inside companies do, the following day? Once a purpose has been established, once a direction or an identity has been agreed, what do you do about it the next day? What do I do differently if I'm a frontline worker? And that was the missing bit, and that's the bit that I saw as an opportunity. But it was also mirrored very much, David, to your, I think, to your point. There was a sort of zeitgeist changed at that
mm.
point. If you remember, that was the time when the Business Roundtable in America published their first, their first big pivot, which was to argue that organizations should do more than just make profits. It was also to take care of the societies through which and with which they operate. It was also when the Financial Times, if you remember, came out with their Purpose Matters statement,
Yep.
a front page editorial commitment from the heart of the capitalist beast, which was just so remarkable and so welcome. And what both of these things, the BRC and also the FT, and of course the third part of the trifecta was Larry Fink and his letter.
Yeah, yeah.
And Larry Fink, so this was investors embracing this idea of purpose as well. So those three things definitely concentrated the mind on the fact that there was a zeitgeist changed happening, and it was important to capture that somehow by trying to answer the question of how do you turn intent into practice.
So that reality 5 years ago seems a distant universe from all of those things.
It does
Rupert,
perhaps for you in the States,
what
maybe.
what the hell happened? What happened to that? I mean, the Business Roundtable in the US would never, ever conceivably be able to do this again in the short term. So where was it vapors of, enthusiasm and virtue signaling? Was it real? How did we get off that pathway, do you think?
So, it's such an apt question right now. We've just published a new report at the Enacting Purpose Initiative on European capitalism and how it's different from American
Mm,
capitalism.
mm,
So this isn't about purpose in capitalism. This is about purpose in distinctive forms of capitalism. And the issue, I think, as was explained to us by one of the participants in our European roundtable of the 21 different major corporations based in Europe, was that American history is very different from European history
mm, mm,
for obvious reasons. In Europe, the idea of stakeholderism, the idea of having a proper embedded responsibility to rebuilding society emanated from the detritus and the shambles and the collapse of Europe after the Second World War. And after that, organizations were being called upon to do some extraordinary rebuilding of the shattered economies in Europe.
mm,
Now, what was interesting is that this wasn't some sort of great, warm, fuzzy, forward-looking, sort of feel-good movement. This was visceral self-interest because European companies realized if they didn't do this, then the strong arm of regulation would come down and force them to do it. And so European companies, right from the late 40s, early 50s, started to embrace this idea of stakeholderism and societal capitalism in a way that was much more embedded into their DNA. Now,
mm,
move fast forward now, and this is just my impression of it. You being based in Canada, not in America, but North America,
yeah.
may have a really interesting perspective. I'd love to hear your view on this and David's as well. But my view is that I think that the tendrils, the roots of that form of stakeholderism were so much more fragile in the US. They
Mm,
didn't have that background of a shattered economy, the rebuilding and the role of corporations in society. And in fact, it was almost the opposite that had happened,
yeah.
which is that this entrepreneurial embracing the red meat eating capitalism world defined America, and it defined its rapid progress technologically, economically, and this idea of pursuing wealth and enabling people to go and to live their dreams is such a part of the American psyche. So I think America's had a very different setting for this. And the problem with with the Business Roundtable in America is that one piece of analysis done after that statement was particularly telling, which asked two questions, which is one, how many companies out of the 181 have actually changed their articles of
Mm,
association?
mhm.
And the answer was none. And the other was how many of them all got their boards to sign off this signing, and the answer was one. So one has to think that really the embracing of that form of stakeholderism and that form of societal capitalism was at best cynical and at
Mm,
worst just non-existent
mm.
in the US. So to my mind, it feels like it never embraced it in the first place, so it's easy to push back on ESG and some of these other elements.
Although this is the day after a Democratic socialist was elected mayor of New York,
Right.
and we have a populist strain that can but I think you're right, but I think there is this polarization, and absolutely, there's a very distinct.
Tell me about polarization though, because this is what I'm struggling with,
Yeah.
which is the idea of how is polarization changing this now? Because America seems like a very strange land to those of us who don't. I don't know if David
Well
agrees, but it feels very hard to interpret. Give us a sense of what it means.
well, I think importantly, we do a lot of polling and we've done 3 polls, well, 2 polls since Trump was elected in the US and 1 around the world. And American public opinion is the same and very consistent on these issues related to the role of business, expectations, trust in business, views of climate change, nature, equality, equity. All of those have and actually gone up a little bit in some cases in counter to other parts of the world. So there's something in Washington that's obviously very dramatic and ever present, and yet the foundational aspects are counter to that a little bit. And in fact, we can see the diversity of that country. I mean, California is not Alabama. And these are as distinct as rural Poland versus central London. Like there's like that. So we are dealing with, but I love this idea. And I know David, you want to jump in, of this cultural orientation to capitalism. And so European capitalism, Chinese capitalism is distinct. Can we say, is there a Brazilian capitalism, et cetera? But
Right.
David, go ahead.
So I think the explanation for polarization is because around the world there's a cost of living crisis, and for an awful lot of people, they are not seeing any real improvements in their living standards for several decades, particularly in terms of US Rust Belt, etc. And what we didn't really take into account anywhere near enough at the time was that the globalization pendulum was swinging so dramatically that it was carving out swathes of jobs,
Mm.
and the consequences of that we're now living with populists in for the fact that right or far right parties are leading in the four major European economies today in the polls, and we have the MAGA movement in the States. And I'm interested if we can take it back to purpose, because not that as a real political scientist, we may have our private kind of ideas and views about politics and political science, but that's not our niche. Our niche is around sustainable business, and I'm really interested in how, in the context of what is going on, because we don't have to agree on all the analysis about what is going on, but in the context of these big shifts, how does a business really enact its purpose so that, as you say, Rupert, people do know when there's this new purpose developed by the good and the great of the business, what it really means for how they should behave when they are dealing with one of their key suppliers or with a frontline customer or whatever.
So, I, two things, if I may, on this. The first is to be very clear about what purpose is and what purpose isn't.
Mm.
There's a lot of confusion, particularly acute in the States, actually, funny enough, between purpose and ESG. They're conflated all the time.
Mm.
And in Europe, actually, funny enough, there's a lot of conflation between purpose and values. So you get organizations who say our purpose is to act with integrity, or that's and so there's even definitional or conceptual confusion right at the heart of this debate. So being clear about what your purpose is and how it's different from values and from your strategy or your mission is step one. And so step one, purpose is why. Why do you exist? Why do you have a place as a legal fiction, as a corporation in society? What is it that you're here to do, broadly speaking? And then your mission or your strategy is the what. That's the what you do. And that, of course, can change every year in terms of your strategic choices. And then there's the how, which is your values. And actually just helping yourself to understand those three differences is so helpful for boards. And in my work with boards, I find that they haven't actually gone through that process for years. They've just assumed their purpose is understood. And I normally start, it's quite fun. I normally start with a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and for every board member, and I say to them, write down the organizational purpose. And then I stand back like the blue touch paper, and 45 minutes later, they're still arguing. And it's always a really intriguing process because it surfaces some things that really should have been thought about and discussed for a long time. And the reason it matters is this second point I was going to make, which is that purpose and social purpose get confused all
Uh-huh.
the time.
And,
So
and
social
what's the
purpose,
distinction? Yeah, what's the distinction?
well, I think is vitally important.
Mhm.
Most people immediately come to this idea that purpose equals social purpose, that there's some form of social agenda that purpose speaks to. I think that underplays and dramatically underplays the power of purpose as an organizing principle. The three of us could decide to set up a company today
Let's
which
do it.
has a purpose, which is to exist for 1 year, rip off our customers, and pay ourselves as much money in the process as we possibly can.
Sign me
Now,
up.
Now, by the way, I don't think we weren't never going to get very far, but it's a purpose, right? It's a purpose, it's an organizing principle, and it helps us make decisions. So, what will we do knowing that purpose? We're going to pay ourselves every month, or every time we get any form of money in, we're going to distribute it straight to ourselves. We're not going to invest in the business or customer service. We're going to behave in certain ways. So, that is an organizing
Mm,
principle. And
mhm.
when you apply that more realistically to companies, companies that understand their purpose will choose to make strategic investments not just based on financial returns, but on strategic fit. And I think that's a vitally, vitally valuable thing for organizations and boards to understand.
Now
We've studied lots of examples of organizations who've got into trouble and crisis. And
mhm.
it's intriguing that almost all the areas where they've got into trouble are areas they would never have gone into if they'd been clear about their purpose in the first place.
Well, and that's really important to clarify. 'Cause I think you're right that the conflating and people kind of grab on their own thing. And from our corporate affairs survey, Rupert, that we do together, we just to give a few numbers from our 2025 study, we found that there are 45% of companies we surveyed are actually discussing purpose more with their executive committee than they did last year. Only 10% are less discussed, so it's buoyant and topical. However, and I think this was your idea to ask this new question, is purpose you is it expressed implicitly or explicitly? And the majority of companies are saying, no, it's an implicit kind of quiet thing rather than a formal explicit. And maybe that's where the manifestation of it is problematic sometimes. What's your thoughts on that implicit versus explicit
Yeah, no,
expression of
it's actually a
purpose?
very contemporary question again, because the new European report, we actually provide a framework for this where we talk about implicit versus explicit and descriptively, specific versus general in terms of how you act these things. And so we've got
Mhm.
four quadrants, and I won't go into the detail. It takes too long to go into that, but just suffice to say that this implicit explicit is a very important way that these type of purposes show up, and it also suits certain types of organizations to be more implicit or more explicit. So it's not that one is better or one is worse. It's just that certain organizational forms suit certain types.
I'm just thinking of the purpose, one of the purpose statements, or I guess they call it a vision statement, but IKEA has of improving the everyday life of the many people, which has so much complexity in that one phrase that the founder did. And you can see the company riffing off of their commercial, the commercial aspects of accessibility and scale and expanding, and also the more, in their case, I guess the more values driven part of the many people and everyday life being a quality of life sort of
I think that's a
expression.
really good example of a crystal clear enabling purpose. And
Mm,
it's a directional enabling purpose. It's
mm.
not strategy. It's not what they do year by year, and it's not their values, but it's why do we exist? What are we here for? And that's a really, really good example of one.
And who owns purpose then, do you think, inside a company typically, or should own purpose?
Well, I think it's stewarded by the board and it's owned by everyone.
Okay.
If it's really going to work, it's got to be owned by everyone. Everyone has to understand their place and what they need to do to ensure the purpose is lived. It's no good thinking that there's a purpose in one part of the organization or there's a committee dealing with that, and I can just get on with doing whatever the hell I want to do outside of that. That's a recipe for inauthenticity. And so the best organizations either co create with their people or make sure that they've got extremely well devolved governance around cascading purpose into how it means and storytelling so that people understand what to do and how to behave, bearing in mind the purpose.
And who's doing it well?
I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question, right? I mean, I think there are some really nice examples. There's obviously the big examples that everyone cites. So people talk about Patagonia as being a particular form of capitalism, which has sort of embraced purpose as its absolute starting point, and
Mhm.
its organizational form follows that. So when you go onto Patagonia's website, it's hard to find a button saying buy. I mean, it's very hard to find that, so the opening page of Patagonia is join the movement. It's an activist movement, which
Mhm.
happens to be an organizational form. And I think, there are a number of organizations who do that quite well. And then there's the sort of organizations that have been both pilloried, but also managed to evince the idea of purpose in a really material way, like Unilever's. So the Unilevers of this world, they've been pilloried for, does mayonnaise have a purpose? But I think that slightly is tongue in cheek and it slightly misrepresents what they're trying to do. What they're doing is they're talking about the fact that actually, from a customer perspective, they have 3 times the level of growth in product sales from brands that speak to some form of organizational purpose. And I think that's a particularly powerful concept. I think Unilever have been probably one of the leaders in it. I mean, it's interesting. There are obviously tensions in this too. It's interesting. I've been following the spin out from Unilever of the Magnum business, which includes Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah.
And it's so kind of intriguing because Ben and Jerry's obviously, when you go onto their website, again, they are an activist movement. And buying ice cream is definitely secondary on their websites. But they've struggled to integrate themselves more firmly within a corporate environment like Unilever. But I do think Unilever does that hybrid version quite
Mm.
well.
Mm.
There's plenty of examples of, I think, organizations who don't do it well. I'd take most of the financial institutions have, I think, struggled to both articulate a pro-societal purpose with authenticity. I think the energy companies, some have done it well, some, I think most have done it quite badly. And you're seeing that with the rollback. If we come back to sustainability, you're seeing that with a number of very significant rollbacks in commitments to ESG from some of these major firms, which just indicates that it wasn't ever really quite there.
Yeah.
It was more of a fad or a salve or a conscience salve for boards, that type of stuff. So that is not really a good answer, David. I apologize. Not really a good answer as to who's good, who's bad.
Oh, that's
But
great.
it gives you a
It-
it gives you a smorgasbord of some
But
some examples.
fair comment. And it does take us back to this question about embedding sustainability isn't something just for this season's fashion. It is something that has to be consistent over time, and you've got to be authentic. And people that you deal with, whether it's inside the business, the employees or the customers, suppliers, even the competitors and so on, have got to feel there's something authentic about the way that that business behaves, which is, I guess, my very amateurish way of sort of raising what have we learned over nearly 20 years of the Oxford Centre now about what goes into building up a long-term reputation. And I came into a lot of this with the Warren Buffett quote in my head about, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, you can lose it in 5 minutes kind of thing.
That
What
kind of happens when Warren Buffett retires, obviously. It's a Berkshire Hathaway.
So
well,
I mean,
don't need to go retire for a bit longer, but anyway. But seriously,
so so I think I guess summarizing the most important contributions that we've been able to make at Oxford. Couple of things. First is that you talk about reputation in the singular, and that's a mistake lots of people make. And it's not just a word or a way of explaining something. It's a much more fundamental, deeper question. This we have multiple reputations for something or with someone. Now, as soon as you say that, everyone goes, "Of course, that makes sense." And yet the Financial Times still writes the reputation of BP is destroyed after Macondo. Well,
Mm.
maybe, but BP, if you remember, BP was awarded a brand new, very significant license in the Gulf of Sidra 3 weeks into the Gulf of Macondo spill. So, it's clearly its reputation in certain spaces wasn't impacted by the Macondo spill at all.
Mm.
So this idea that you have dimensions of reputation is, I think, the really important starting point.
Mm.
And the reason why that's important for boards is that it then enables you to think of reputation as strategy.
Mhm.
Because what it means is you can think very carefully about which reputations matter and which reputations don't. They may be embarrassing for the board or they may be annoying, but there are going to be certain core reputations which absolutely are central to the survival of an organization. And in identifying that, that helps you to allocate resources, scarce resources, financial, human, social, to identifying and influencing those type of reputations. So that's the first thing, is there's multiple dimensions of reputations. The second thing is that you can influence, not control reputation. So and that's a scary concept for managers, right? It's a very scary one because managers are masters of the universe. When you're the CEO of a large company, you feel that the world marches to your decisions. And they're often right, right? And in finance, you can say, I want a finance report out by the board meeting on Tuesday. I want a marketing plan in market in January. But you can't say, I want a good reputation by Tuesday. That just doesn't happen, right? It's not how it works. So this idea of engaging with a very valuable asset,
Mm.
but doing it in a way where you have to work through influence, not control, is, I think, a very, very important distinction
Mhm.
around reputation and how it shows up in organizational life. And the final, I mean, there's lots of insights, but if I'm forced to drive it down to three really big ones, the final one is the dual dimensionality. And so you talk about Warren Buffett's famous quote, and I use it in class in the same way as you will too, David. And Chris has heard this many times, but actually, it's nice to be able to say he was wrong, right? And he's wrong because reputations are plural, not singular. So we've covered that. But actually, there are two really, really different dimensions to reputation.
Mm.
The first is perceptions of capability. So, am I a good banker? Can I structure finance well? Am I good at extracting natural resources? Can I dig, organize my assets, pull them out at the right time, right place with the right money? Am I a good lawyer? Can I make good clothes? Right? These are all perceptions of my capability as an organization. And the capability reputations are leveraging whether or not I can use the assets at my disposal to create something of value. Capability reputation, hugely important, but it's only one dimension. The second dimension is not got nothing to do with whether you're good at making the products or doing good services. It's the how. How do I show up? And this is character reputation. This is organizational character. So this is a question of how do I show up with my different stakeholders? What can I expect in my interactions with you as an organization? And when you distinguish between these two, everything becomes so much more vibrant, clear, and
Mm.
helpful. Because capability reputations, as it turns out, matter most to consumers. Of course it does, because if it's a capability to create a shirt or a jumper, I'm buying the shirt or the jumper. I'm very interested in the quality of that shirt or that jumper or the oil or the legal advice or whatever it's going to be.
Mm.
And that's the dominant frame through which I'm going to regard the reputation of the firm. Character matters most to counterparties. And that's, could be investors, it could be regulators, could be suppliers, it could be employees. And again, that makes so much more sense. So I may, as an employee of Goldman Sachs, right? I may be delighted that I'm working for a high prestige, well respected organization, which is very good at what it does. Very,
Mm.
very good at what it does. But how I'm treated matters enormously. If I'm ill, what's going to happen? So that's an employee's perspective. If I'm a regulator, do I expect them to be proactive in the event they've got a problem? Are they going to be honest and truthful? That matters more than their quality of product. If I'm a supplier, how are they going to treat me if things get tough? Are they going to push me out to 120 days supply, or are they going to be 60 days in my supply chain, right? Google are particularly bad at this. Google,
Mm.
pay people very late, and they're a massive company and they have lots of small suppliers who get paid at 120 days, right? So, these speak to organizational character. And organizational character is what that matters to counterparties. And if you think about these two dimensions, you can then do things differently. If you're a management board and there's a capability problem, fix the product. That's going to resolve your perception of capability. If it's a question of character, you've got to fix governance. And that's a really, really valuable piece of insight as to translating reputations more widely, which people get confused about, into something very specifically valuable, very specifically actionable, and impacting certain particular stakeholders in certain particular ways. So
Uh,
once so
that's
once so once that becomes clear, we've then got a framework for analyzing just how reputation adds value in organizational life.
David and I both want to jump in because we're both
Go
stimulated
on.
by this fantastic assessment of these three things. But just I'll go quickly, David. But going backwards, I think I think the capability versus character is brilliant, and it is clarifying, as you say, Rupert. And in our corporate affairs survey to respond, we asked corporate affairs professionals for their companies, what matters more, and character dominates capabilities. They're both important, but there's this dominance that's interesting. On the issue of multiple dimensions of reputation, I think that's really important. And in our reputation work, we are seeing increasingly culture, geography, and stakeholder audiences fragmenting more on what they're seeing, what matters to them. So I think this multiplication of reputations has made this more complicated and harder. And I think the question I've gotten from one of our board members actually last week was saying, is reputation short term? Can it deliver? Because there's such a transactional nature given the uncertainty in the corporate world. So, do we see a tie in with reputation and short termism at all? Or is it always just a long game to build that?
I think it's a great question, and I'm going to simplify the answer by saying short term reputation is in fact sentiment.
Uh huh.
Long term is reputation.
Okay.
Reputations don't change that quickly.
Mm,
Character ones, you can be a hero to zero quite quickly, but ultimately, capability of reputation is very, very static.
mm,
It's
mm,
hard to see organizations being destroyed on lack of capability very quickly, right? I mean, Arthur Anderson, but that wasn't very quick.
mm.
Kodak, that wasn't very quick. You know,
Yeah, yeah. Toyota can do a couple recalls and still their reputation is
Apple have had
intact.
what,
Yeah.
16 Apple gates, and they're still regarded.
Yeah.
So I think reputation long term, sentiment is short term.
So I just wanted to ask rather a factual question, Rupert, to follow up. Oxford also has the Oxford Character Project. Where does what you're doing and what the enacting purpose initiative is doing fit in to the constellation with that Oxford Character Project?
Yeah, so the Oxford Character Project actually has got nothing to do with the business school or us. It sits somewhere else in the university. And I, like you, immediately latched on this as we started developing. And I wrote about capability character in the reputation game. That was where the idea took proper shape and form. And as soon as that came out, actually Edward Brooks, who runs the Character Project, got in touch and said, "Oh, very interesting. You're talking about character, and that's what we do." And I was like, "Oh, that's great. Let's talk about what they do." And I think they do excellent work, but it's not really related to the type of things that we talk about. Although we're still looking, as you know, in academia, we're always looking to try and build bridges and find links. And so I'm very keen to continue to find it. But no, it doesn't really have much relevance to the work that we're doing.
Well, okay, so what you did talk about though was governance of kind of longer term relationships and this kind of organizational character relationships, which comes back to culture, doesn't it?
Mhm. Yeah.
And what
Well,
have
part of it is culture. Culture is where people normally go when they think of reputations and long-term stuff. But I would just I think culture is vitally important. It's an incredible piece of the machinery. It's the glue, the oil, whatever you want to call it in the engine. Culture, is vitally important, but it is not the starting point and the end point for reputation or indeed purpose. It's a part of the framework that enables these things to actually work. The bit that I think, and culture, I mean, culture, I think that there's wonderful work in culture in many different frames. And I often teach, the sociability solidarity frame, which came out of London Business School. And there's a whole bunch of really fun frames, and we could spend an entire, hour talking about culture. The bit though that piqued my interest in your question, David, is you talked about time and long, and Chris had it as well, long term, short term. I'm exploring the idea at the minute, and I just thought I'd get your quick take on it, of a new institute that would try and deal with time in a much more interesting way. So it's an idea that I'm calling the Governance of Time initiative.
Ooh, interesting.
And this idea, so if we bring it back to sustainability, right?
Mhm.
We've got at least three major departments inside Oxford. So we've got the Smith School, which is for the environment, enterprise and the environment. We've got the business school that does business stuff. We've got the Blavatnik School that does politics. Each of us has a serious number of scholars and thinkers thinking about sustainability issues. But each of us is thinking about this same subject through vastly different time lenses. If you think of the Smith School, they're thinking 30 to 50 years. If you're thinking the Blavatnik School, it's 4 to 5 year political cycles.
Mm.
And the business school, anything from algorithmic trading to 3 year strategies, right?
Right.
So this same issue
Mm.
but through a very, very different time aperture. And I mean, it's too good an opportunity with you two being here not to just get a sense of what you think about the idea of organizing new thinking on these challenges around
I
sustainability
think the
through the
dimen
lens of tackling these different time perspectives and understanding the role that they play.
I think it's a brilliant idea because I think the the dimension of time is always the differentiating factor between a decision point on, is this worth the investment to change our business model or approach, invest in renewables or go to a circular economy model
Right.
in a corporate perspective. And it always comes down to the time frame. If you say, oh, a 10-year, yeah, good, makes good sense. 2 quarters, not a hope in hell of it working with the framework. So I think that's interesting. I think the notion of governance of time is also really a powerful, and I think it is our most precious resource, right? Like constantly. So how, we don't want to monetize, well, I guess we do monetize time, but if this is a precious resource, how do we understand it and respond to it? And I think especially in training business thinkers, this goes back maybe to the cultural perspective. Do European business people see time differently than American?
Right.
Do
Right.
I
Very
suspect
interesting. Yeah.
Chinese business people, or certainly the Politburo in China has a much longer time scale.
Yeah, they've
You
got a 40-year AI strategy, right?
Right.
Whereas we've got a 3-year market-driven AI strategy, if that.
And this
So
has to have implications, like,
right,
what's better? And then even if it go, it's a very different perspective outside of the business world, but how do indigenous people understand time?
right.
And what decision-making capabilities are they making given their ability to manage and steward, natural ecosystems for millennia? So yeah, that's
Yeah,
fascinating. Da
brilliant, brilliant. I
David?
think all of these are just critically valuable questions. Thank you, Chris. David?
No, I love the idea too. I mean, I was reflecting, um, because the Chinese certainly do have a much, much longer time horizon because their system of government and society makes that much easier to do. But then that has all kinds of downsides to it that aren't necessarily so attractive. Um, but somewhere like Singapore
Right.
and places like the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Government within the National University of Singapore, doing some really interesting work around how do we take all of the insights that science and academia are developing and make those accessible to public policymakers in kind of language and then in terms of decision trees that are meaningful for them. Now, again, Singapore isn't the same political system as the UK or Canada or the US. So again, there they can afford some longer term time horizons than especially politicians in
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I think that Singapore's such a good example of this. And I mean, one of the thinkers at the Blavatnik School, Tom Hale, has written a very intriguing book called Long Problems, which addresses this. And it's a brilliant, I thoroughly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this question. Because what he does is he talks about how do we govern for future generations?
Mm,
Right? That is such a hard question.
mm,
The idea that I might try and make decisions today for not my children, but my children's grandchildren. That's a that's so difficult, because I've got no idea quite what that means. The context in which I might be making decisions about what's changing for them. And his book sets this out, and there's some interesting examples here, which where nation states like Singapore are trying to think about this. So there's ministries for the future, which are being set up all over the world,
mm.
understanding the needs of future generations and trying to hold political decision makers to account today for long-term decisions which can be meaningful for society over mid to long-term time horizons. And I think that's really interesting too.
Well,
and
and
family. Sorry.
the core definition of sustainable development, as written in Our Common Future in the 1987 seminal report, is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their
Right.
own needs. So it is the question, and anything sustainability, net zero, 2050, but these are all long-term challenges. Yet the incentive structures in the short term don't allow us to pivot. The one other quick point. First of all, given your list of responsibilities. Do you have time for this institute, Rupert? You've got to figure that out.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big question.
Another example that comes to mind, I was at a PDAC, the Professional Development Mining Conference in Toronto last year, and watching a fantastic discussion talking about critical minerals. They had indigenous people and mining companies on the panel discussing, and the different viewpoints of these two entities were very powerful. The mining companies like, all right, the demand's there. We need these things. These are really important for things like the green economy, but also security. So let's go. And the indigenous people were like, we see your points. It's going to take a couple of years to talk and get through. So the timescales of this thing are so divergent. And so I think understanding these perspectives and finding ways to appropriately accelerate, and you can see it on AI too. I mean, this data center stuff is going to, run into the wall of local community social license to operate. And given the intensity of trying to build these things, it's an extraordinarily difficult dimension to manage.
And in terms of, so who is able to take this longer term time horizon, then multi-generation family businesses
Right.
obviously have a lot of lessons to
Right.
to share with us, don't they?
Right, yeah, it's a really good observation, and there's a lot of work being done to understand how and why multi-generational firms operate. How do they make decisions? Do they actually act in long-term interests, or do they fragment and just try and leverage whatever capital they can today out of a long-term family? Do they monetize their family history? And there's a lot of really interesting work on that. And I agree, that's a potential model, as are hybrid models as well of governance. I mean, one of the things I think, linking it back, tying, I hope, neatly back between sustainability and reputation. One of the things which I think I've observed, and is definitely a feature of this idea of the governance of time initiative, but is a broader idea, is the role of storytelling
Hmm.
in shaping sustainability. Because I think, I mean, who was it? Someone said, very bright, Churchill or someone said, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing and expect a different outcome, right? And we've had 10 years of bashing people over the head with numbers and science
Yes.
around sustainability, and it hasn't really worked. We're still not meeting all these targets that we impose, etc. And I think it's time for a change. I think it's time for a change where we've got to hero storytelling. And it's a weird place for something like Oxford to be in,
And what do
because
you mean hero storytelling? What does that mean? Yeah.
we have to lead with storytelling, not lead with science.
Mm.
And all of what we've been doing is it's experts, normally scientific experts and policy experts, talking to each other.
Mhm.
The voice of the people at large, the general public, has been largely either ignored or just overlooked.
Yeah.
And I think it's time to change that. And
Yep.
one of the things I'm really intrigued about is whether we could do things differently. So at Oxford, with these initiatives, the governance of time, we've got the Oxford Ministry for the Future, which is Annette Mike's really brilliant idea with Kim Stanley Robinson,
Mm.
who wrote the Ministry for the Future book. We've got Juliana Reinecker and Colin Mayer working on this 2050 Institute. There's a lot of really energizing things happening. But the one bit that I think is missing is, how do we tell better stories, right? And that's, I think, got a really fundamental governance problem at the heart of it, because the people running these institutes are people like us, right? They're scientists, they're theoreticians, they're institutional
They
elites.
don't have much of a life, Rupert. We don't have much of a life beyond that.
Well, the one thing that we're not is brilliant storytellers. So what I've been trying to do is think about, how do we build connections with the poetry teams? How do we build the theatre directors? How do we include the philosophers? How do we include the psychologists? How do we include different disciplines, who, I bet you, if they were on this call, they'd be thinking, what are you guys talking about with sustainability? You haven't addressed anything like the most important debates, right? And we're at risk of just talking ourselves into oblivion, right?
So-
Because we're talking the same thing all the time.
And we were in a workshop recently when someone said the same thing, that narratives and storytelling. And they said, the good thing is we could do it right now.
I think we
it's
could.
free, and we could be better right now.
I think we could, but we have to include different voices in
Yes,
the
yeah,
design.
yeah,
So, the COP summits, all the rest of it. We got to hero people who can storytell,
Yeah.
not just wonky people with lots of brains, right?
Yeah.
Great. And we mustn't be pushing out fake news. So science has to underpin, but storytelling should lead.
Lead.
And I think that's a really important thing. And actually, it ties, I hope it ties the conversation. It feels like, to me, it ties the conversation quite nicely back between sustainability and reputation and purpose, because that nexus brings us back to the power of storytelling, which, bringing in a hopeful note on AI is that AI can't storytell. It can't storytell very well at all.
No.
And all it does is it pattern recognizes what we've done.
Got it.
The great innovators, the great storytellers of our age are still humans. They're still us. And
And maybe
it's
so. And you did wrap a bow on it. It's as if you've been studying communications for a long time, Rupert. That your
yeah.
expertise shone through. But thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I've learned a lot as I expected to do in this conversation. Thank you
So
very
we,
much.
we really appreciate it. And David, any last thoughts on your end?
So I'm looking forward to hearing the report from next August's gathering of the Oxford Reputation Centre's Academy with all these brilliant scholars, and that there's going to be some famous movie director or some really famous person who scripted a brilliantly powerful series on television that is going to be leading the workshop around storytelling.
Inshallah. I think absolutely right.
Excellent. Good. Thank you, Rupert Younger. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. If you enjoyed it, please share this this episode especially, and give us a rating. But very much appreciate everyone tuning in. Thank you.